your burger is served. And this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to another edition of The Racket Report, the podcast that takes you inside the world of organized crime. From the perspective of people that have been in organized crime, from prosecutors, judges, journalists, writers, you name it. We look at it from all angles. And one of the podcasts that we did most recently, which got really an incredible response, was the discussion that we had about the life and crimes, not to mention the death of Whitey Bulger. And one of the more interesting things that listeners found about Whitey Bulger's whole criminal career is that during so much of it, he seemed to be working with the federal government. And he might have even been aided in his crimes by the FBI. Well, given the response to that discussion, it gave me the thought to spend some time examining the case of Greg Scarpa with the man that knows the case of Greg Scarpa better than anyone. Because this is about a lot more than just telling an interesting story. This is about a lot more than sensationalism. As you'll see here with the Greg Scarpa case, there is a very, very troubling trend that the FBI has of partnering with really horrible criminals, including mass murderers. Now, the Scarpa case has been covered before, as has the role of Scarpa's FBI handler, Lindley DeVecchio. And one of the people that covered this case a bit, at least about 8 or 9 years ago, was Anderson Cooper, when Anderson Cooper was with 60 Minutes and did a profile on Lindley DeVecchio, the FBI agent that we're going to be focusing on here. Here's a clip of how Anderson Cooper began that profile.
The Brooklyn District Attorney's case fell apart when a key witness was thoroughly discredited during the trial. Former FBI agents who supported DeVecchio applauded as the charges were dismissed. But the judge who released DeVecchio criticized him and the FBI for making a, quote, deal with the devil, letting Scarpa get away with his crimes for close to 15 years. DeVecchio retired from the FBI in 1996 and now runs a private investigations business in Florida. He feels he's been wrongly accused and unfairly maligned, which is why he's written a book and is speaking to us.
We effectively broke the back of organized crime by using people such as Gregory Scarpa.
You basically gave this guy a pass because he was giving you good information.
If that's a perception that people have, so be it. I can't change their mind.
But is that the truth?
No, I don't think it's the truth at all.
You kept him out on the streets. A guy who you knew at the time was murdering people.
It's wonderful to sit in your ivory tower somewhere and say, oh, how can you do that? Well, why don't you go out in the street and try working that sometime? Try making a case. Try talking to a wise guy. Try getting that information.
The judge criticized the FBI and Lindley DeVecchio for making a deal with the devil. Well, the author of the book, Deal with the Devil, the FBI's secret 30-year relationship with the mafia killer, also happens to be one of the most accomplished and most recognized investigative reporters that I've ever known. He is a veteran investigative reporter, screenwriter, and author of several books, including Deal with the Devil. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Peter Lance. Peter, thanks for joining me. It's great to talk to you again.
It's always great to be on with you, Frank. You keep New York hours, as do I, even though I live on the West Coast. So I like to do this late at night with you whenever we can.
Same here. It's a lot easier to do when you're on the West Coast, believe me. So let's begin at the beginning before we get into the details and the depths of the Scarpa-DeVecchio relationship. Who exactly was Greg Scarpa?
Okay, Greg Scarpa Sr. I'm going to talk about Senior and Junior here. Great. Because his son has a remarkable story unto himself, and I actually spoke to him for about an hour tonight. He got out of prison after serving 32 years of a 40-year sentence. He got a compassionate release in 2020, and he's in great spirits, and he's working a job, and he's in a good place in his life, despite what happened to him over the years. Anyway, so Greg Scarpa Sr. was a remarkable man. He was kind of built like a linebacker, 5'10", really kind of a thick build, and he was an unscrupulous character with a brilliant mind. I think if Greg Scarpa Sr. had gone straight, I mean, becoming a corporate tycoon is going straight, he could have been the CEO of a major corporation, because what he accomplished over the years while being an absolute criminal, while he actually stopped counting after 50 homicides in the course of his career, most of which were committed while he was a top echelon informant for the FBI. I mean, his story is the Whitey Bulger story on steroids, okay? And Greg, among his many achievements as a criminal, he had the largest fake credit card ring in New York, the largest high-end stolen car ring in New York. He netted typically, $2.5 million a year from a sports betting operation from the money he had on the street. He grossed $70,000 a week in drug sales. He had an interesting crew called the Bypass Bank Crew that would go into banks like on the 4th of July weekend when they'd be closed for 3 or 4 days, and they would go in and only drill safe deposit boxes because they could get to them. And on one job, on July 4th weekend in 1974, he netted $15 million in 13 duffel bags full of cash and jewels. He was absolutely unscrupulous, but on the other hand, he was an interesting family man. He had 3 separate families, or 3 separate wives at the same time. He married Connie Forrest, a woman, in 1949. They had 4 kids, including Greg Jr., who started doing crimes for his father at the age of 16. Then, while still married to Connie, who he shipped off to New Jersey and a horse farm, Greg moved in with Linda Diana, who was a gorgeous brunette, 19 years younger. She'd been dating wise guys since her mid-teens. He had 2 children with Linda, Joey and little Linda, but in an effort to hide the fact that, they were Scarpas, she married a guy named Charlie Shiro, who thought they were his kids.
Oh,
he
my.
believed they were his kids. So he'd go to work in the morning, and Linda would let Greg Sr. in the back door, and they would, be in flante delicto for X number of hours, and then Charlie would get home and hug the kids, etc. But Greg Sr. treated them like his loving children of his own, and they were his kids. But then, while married to Connie and living common law with Linda, he ran off to Las Vegas in around the 75 or so, and he married Lily Dejani, a 35-year-old former Miss Israel, a total knockout. She looked like Gina Lollobrigida, okay? And he set her up in on Sutton Place, in a co-op apartment on Sutton Place. And years later, when she was involved with an abortion doctor named Eli Skolnick, who was having financial issues and threatened to go to the feds because he knew about her affair with Scarpa, one day he was hiding out kind of in his parents' home in Queens, and he was leaving for the day when, members of Scarpa's crew showed up, and Skolnick was murdered in the lobby. So, Greg was ruthless, but he was also very tolerant of his personal relationships. And perhaps the most interesting thing about his personal life is, at one point, Linda Shiro, his common law wife, saw this guy, Larry Mazza, who you may have interviewed. Sure. Larry. He's got a book out. And Larry Mazza was this kind of handsome delivery boy for a grocery store in Brooklyn. He worked stocking shelves, kind of had those Frankie Avalon good looks. And one day Linda was shopping, and she spotted him, and she mentioned it to Greg. And Greg said as he would give her Larry as a birthday present one year, like he would countenance her making love to him. And Linda said, so I make love to the guy, and then you whack him later, And then, no, let me see how I feel, Linda. Let me see how I feel. And basically, Greg hid in the closet while, Larry and Linda, got it on one day in, at the Shiro house, or maybe later Greg Sr. bought her a house for the kids. But anyway, and he took a liking to Larry, and he began schooling him. First, he taught him how to shoot. He taught him how to drive a getaway car. He involved him as a lookout guy in some of the bank scores. and eventually he taught him how to kill people. And Larry became part of a key element in his crew when Scarpa ignited what was the third war in the Colombo family in the early 90s. 14 people were killed, including a couple of innocent bystanders. And it was all of a war fomented entirely by Scarpa Sr. with the intent of, essentially taking over the Colombo crime family so that the FBI would have a seat on the New York Commission. Can you imagine that? What a plum that would be for the Bureau?
Oh, my.
To have their guys sitting at the head of a crime family in New York. And so as a result, R. Lindley DeVecchio, who was then supervisory special agent in charge of both the Colombo squads and the Bonanno crime family squad in the New York office of the FBI, totally embraced him. He was Scarpa's handler and literally let him get away with murder. I mean, I say that without hesitation. My book is incredibly well annotated, as you know, with thousands of endnotes, and it stood the test of time. And Lynn DeVecchio, after I wrote my second book, where I first wrote about the Scarpa story, my second of 4 HarperCollins books, it was called Cover Up. It was mostly about the 9/11 Commission. The Brooklyn DA indicted Lynn DeVecchio on 4 counts of murder conspiracy. There was a trial in Brooklyn, a short-lived trial in the fall of 2007, and Lynn got off for reasons we can get into later on.
Yeah, I want to break down a few of the different things that you just alluded to here, and I want to go into the role of Scarpa Jr. As well. But in terms of, you mentioned the possibility that Greg Scarpa Sr. was in a position to become the boss of the Colombo crime family while he was working as a top echelon informant with the FBI. How high did Scarpa get within the hierarchy of the Colombo crime family? How close did he make it to becoming the boss?
Well, what's very interesting is that in Lynn DeVecchio's book, he actually says he was never even a capo, which is ridiculous. I mean, I show that he became a capo, I think, in the early 50s, a capo regime, one of the, like a captain level. Mm-hmm. But the irony was that because what he would do that was so brilliant, and this is a guy who's walking the edge of a razor blade. Why? Because on one hand, he's ratting out the mob, his own family, so he can knock guys out of competition above him in the mob, so he can rise up in the mob effectively, be a power source, although he's pretending like he has no interest in anything other than just doing the business of his own, his own enterprise, kicking up to Carmine Persico, who was the titular boss, he was convicted in the Mafia Commission case and doing life in California prison. So, but Scarpa had tremendous power because of his relationship with the FBI, because they left him on the street. And 2 different strike forces, one in Brooklyn and one in Chicago, organized crime strike forces of the Justice Department and U.S. attorney's offices were trying to put Scarpa away. One time, the Secret Service, who was then in charge of counterfeiting, busted him on this stolen credit card thing, and they had him dead to rights. And they were going to try and get him put away. But the FBI always went to Judge Leo I. Glasser, who was the judge in the last Gotti trial, who would, in my opinion, sign any warrant the FBI put in front of him. He was very pliable, if you will, when it came to the Bureau. And Judge Glasser basically, at that point in Greg's life, he had contracted HIV. It's an extraordinary story, and people have to read Deal with the Devil to get the details. But he got HIV through a blood transfusion. A member of his crew had it, and he went from 220 pounds to like 120 pounds, became emaciated, but he was still hanging in there. And the FBI, including DeVecchio, convinced the judge that he didn't have long to live. So he basically got for this massive credit card scam where he could have gotten at least 10 years in federal prison. It was a wrist slap, I think $10,000 and some kind of probation. That allowed him to stay on the street and then foment this third Colombo war in the early 90s that essentially killed all these people. So it was all the FBI running interference for him. That's what DeVecchio did, much like John Connolly did for Whitey Bulger in Boston. Basically running interference. Now, John Connolly ended up getting jammed up and doing prison time because his boss in the Bureau, to kind of get ahead of things, turned state's evidence, or flipped, if you will, on John Connolly. So John became became the victim, if you will, in that case. and went to prison. Whereas with Scarpa, they did not want Lynn DeVecchio at all costs. The Justice Department did not want him to go down. And during his trial in Brooklyn, they had sent up major people from the Justice Department to sit in the jury booth in this it was a bench trial for a federal judge, to stare at the various FBI agents who were on the stand to allegedly testify that Scarpa Sr. had been slipped, confidential and material from DeVecchio, and they were like looking at these agents like hawks. So the agents were completely, basically, eliminated as any kind of effective witnesses. And eventually, as I said, the case went south for other reasons. But the Bureau was the main reason Scarpa prospered. But remember, if he had been found out by any of the family members that he was doing this, he would have been killed by the family. So he was walking this razor's edge, and he did it successful. He was just he was playing three-dimensional chess, and the Bureau was playing checkers.
You alluded to the fact that he stopped counting after 50 homicides, and you said that a lot of that, almost all of that, was done while he was working as a top echelon informant with the FBI. Do we know when his relationship with the FBI began? Yeah, it started in 1961. And then he did it for a few months, and then he stopped, and then he quickly returned in early 1962. But here's what's really amazing, Frank. If you go to my website, peterlance.com, there's what they used to call airtels, the original memos from FBI informants. Confidential informants were called airtels, and virtually all of the airtels in the early years of Scarpa being opened as an informant went directly to J. Edgar Hoover, and all later on they changed the name to FBI 209 memos. We've all heard about the famous FBI 302 memos that are meant to be potentially go public someday. Mm-hmm. Well, the 209 memos, for obvious reasons, were highly confidential because they involved, the various informants had, the CIs, as they called them, had numbers, and Scarpa's, I think, was an 8-digit number that ended with 34, so they called him 34. But in any case, he started in 61, and here's what's amazing. Joe Valachi, who was always credited as the number one, the first real principal mafia turncoat to testify before the McClellan Rackets Committee in like a month before JFK was killed in 1963, September. Joe Valachi gives the entire playbook on the mafia, the private induction ceremony, the boss's name, the consigliere, the use of the word good fella to refer to soldiers or button men, even the oath they took in the induction ceremony, all of this stuff, right? Well, everybody thought, my God, how did this guy know this stuff? Because he was kind of a knuckle dragger. He was a driver, and sure, he'd killed a few people, but he was not high up in the mafia, which J. Edgar Hoover mistakenly called La Cosa Nostra instead of just Cosa Nostra, because what it means is our thing. But anyway, Hoover loved little 3-digit terms for things, so he called it the LCN. But what really happened, and I discuss this in detail in my book, is that because Greg Scarpa Sr. was feeding this information to Hoover, including there's this airtel that maybe I'll just send a link to you so that you can put it on the website at some point. It gives the entire playbook to Hoover of the mafia in 1961, 2 years before Valachi ever sang to this committee. You obviously, if Greg Scarpa Sr. began cooperating with the FBI in 1961, 1962, I would imagine a lot of that would predate his relationship with DeVecchio. Do we know when he began working with DeVecchio directly?
Yeah, so he worked with a guy named Anthony Villano, and I need to tell you a little bit about their unique relationship. Tony Villano was a brick agent. In fact, he wrote a memoir called Brick Agent, which is what street FBI agents refer to themselves as, where I'm a brick agent, I'm not management kind of thing, And so Tony, he worked with Tony until 75, and then he was getting very violent, and he was getting sloppy, and Tony was drinking a lot.
Meaning
so
Greg was getting violent and sloppy?
Greg Scarpa Sr. was particularly violent, but Tony, I didn't mean Greg was getting sloppy. Tony was getting sloppy. He had a real alcohol problem, and he was getting, and it was starting to. Some of what was going on with Greg was the truth of what was going on was getting to the brass in Washington. Virtually every 2 months, there would be an FBI memo that would say this informant is nonviolent and reliable and trustworthy. They kept putting those admonitions into Washington, D.C. while these guys are wreaking havoc on the street. Okay. And so they shut Scarpa down for 5 years. And during that time, J. Edgar Hoover's best, weapon against what Linda Vecchio later called the mafia enemy dried up. There was they weren't making cases; things were not going well. So when Linda Vecchio came in, and Linda Vecchio, his father was career military and spent time growing up in Italy. At one point, he spoke Italian, but he was from Fresno. He was kind of a white bread, paisan, if you will, right? He wasn't like a New York kind of red sauce kind of a guy. Sure. And so, but Linda Vecchio, anyway, so when you start working in the New York office of the FBI, which is called the NYO, which is the biggest, office outside of headquarters, and you're working organized crime, the key is developing informants. The more informants you have, the faster you can rise up, and the better the results you get from these informants. Okay, so he goes in and he educates himself quickly and starts reading some of the closed informant files because he hears the rumors about this guy Villano and he had this guy Scarpa, and he basically approaches Greg, goes to his house, and basically says, "I'd like to reopen you." And Scarpa kind of auditions him, and I'll just kind of frame it like this in retrospect. You know how Trump had the meeting with James Comey where he basically said, "So if you're going to be my guy, right?" Jimmy, like that, got that famous meeting allegedly that happened that Comey wrote about and everything. Well, anyway, that's what Greg basically said to Scarpa, to Linda Vecchio in so many words, and DeVecchio in so many words, and I wasn't there, and so I'm not gonna do a verbatim on the relationship, but Scarpa came to believe that Linda Vecchio would give him the kind of latitude that Anthony Villano gave him. And let me just tell you a little bit about the Villano relationship. Scarpa would go out, and they paid him informally, I think in this whole career with the Bureau, about $158,000 formally, but you can multiply that times about 8, depending on the value today, what the money would be. But more importantly, what Scarpa would do, he'd go out and hijack a truck, a high-end load of, one time they hijacked plutonium, and another time mercury, and then obviously, trucks full of scotch, whiskey, and dresses and fur coats, and the usual things that you'd see on The Sopranos, right? And then Scarpa would do the work, and then he would tell the Bureau about it. He would keep 30% of the swag himself and sell it off. He'd give 20% or the rest of it back, and he would get a bonus for that Villano would kick back to him. So in other words, he's literally, I'm telling you, this is like a revolving door. This is what this guy would do. And that's how brilliant he was in terms of using his position. One time there were these famous jewels called the Regina Pace jewels from this famous church in Brooklyn that were revered by Italians all over the country. And some low-level guys came in and just stole these jewels, and the Bureau went nuts, and it was a top priority, and Anthony Villano, using Scarpa, got the jewels returned, and naturally there was a big reward paid, and Scarpa profited from it.
When did people suspect, when I say people, I mean either independent sources, local law enforcement sources, underworld sources, journalists, anybody. When did people suspect that there was something fishy going on in terms of the relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa? And then when did people know that there was something fishy going on between DeVecchio and Scarpa?
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, I don't, it's been a while, and I don't have I have the book available. I could try and look it up. But
no. Well, I mean,
no. In general, I'm giving you the gist. In terms of the year, when the two strike forces, and this is later on in Scarpa's career and well into his relationship with Lynn, when these two strike forces, one in Brooklyn and one in Chicago, came after Scarpa, okay, and then the Secret Service came after him for the stolen credit card thing, right? And then he got this wrist slap from Judge Glasser. That was well into his relationship because he already had HIV by then, and he died in 1994. But obviously, other feds and other agencies began to suspect that there were wrong, and they sent memos up and everything. And nobody was pointing the finger at DeVecchio directly until the third Colombo War. And then, by the way, this is another interesting thing that occurred to me as I was writing the book. The Colombo crime family, the Gambinos always had like 600 made guys. They were the biggest of the families.
Sure.
And the Bonanno, Lucchese, and Genovese families would often have typically 350 made guys, and then below them for earners, if you will. So the Gambinos were the biggest. The Gotti's family were the biggest. But in any case, of the Colombo family later, run first by Joe Colombo, took over from Profaci, that was the original guy that had the family, and then he died, and then there was a struggle for power, and then Carmine Persico ultimately got it. But in the meantime, Joe Colombo, who was famously shot in Columbus Circle, who formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League, and if you saw the offer that I think it was a terrific series on Paramount about the making of The Godfather, Al Ruddy, who's an old friend of mine. I mean, he got to tell a story from his point of view, which is kind of a dream. That whole relationship with the Italian-American Civil Rights League that the other families were freaking out over, like, don't bring attention to us. And Joe Colombo's on the cover of Time magazine, and he kind of got off on it, And eventually he was shot and in this big rally in Columbus Circle, and he went into a coma and died many years later. So he was taken out, and eventually while Carmine Persico took over, later the Vic Arena became the acting boss, and Vic Arena was a kind of a Seventh Avenue Garmento.
But Scarpa was squarely with the Persico faction, right?
Oh yeah, Scarpa goes with he was clearly with the Persico faction. But what I'm getting at is that Vic Arena, who was also with the Persico faction, became the acting boss when Carmine the Snake Persico ends up in Lompoc, for life, right? The federal prison. And so what happens is Vic Arena is a Seventh Avenue guy. He's not really a violent guy. He didn't even have bodyguards. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. He had his two sons that were made guys, and he lived in the 5 towns in Long Island near the Chosen People. He wasn't like
right. He wasn't a street ruffian. Right.
He wasn't a street guy, and whereas Scarpa was the penultimate street guy. Okay, and so the FBI eventually began, and Scarpa instigated this. Scarpa Sr. I'm talking about all the time now, up until we get to Greg Jr. Scarpa Sr. with Lynn DeVecchio, but particularly Scarpa Sr. led on all this stuff, decided that Vic Arena was vulnerable. Scarpa Sr.'s consigliere, Carmine Sessa, who was a little guy, Carmine Sessa made a move on Vic Arena one night when he was just driving home in his Mercedes by himself, and they came up by next to him in a stoplight, and he saw them, and there was a chase sequence through the 5 towns, and then so he gets home, and his two sons come out with shotguns because they were smart enough not to keep any handguns in the house, you know what I mean? So they basically, but now they know they're marked, okay, and they know that, and the word is that Greg Scarpa Sr. is instigating this, and it's going to get violent. His life was ending, he had HIV, so he saw the time ending, as did the Bureau, for his ability to take over the family. So at one point, this is all documented in my book. At one point, as this war begins, and Scarpa completely fomented the war. I mean, he created the war. There's some question that he even created a phony incident outside of his house where his daughter was shot at, or that he may have actually instigated it, because that was his excuse for going to war violently, breaking, the peace that they had. So Scarpa, at one point, his son Joey, by Linda Shiro, Joey Scarpa, I guess Scarpa was his last name. Joey planted a bag of guns outside. Vic Arena had this house on Long Island. No, he had his girlfriend. He was staying with his guma, his girlfriend, somewhere. And there was like a porch that was unfinished, and it was kind of a slope coming down from the house, so that there wasn't anything enclosing the porch in the back, right? So Joey plants a bag of guns from the Colombo War under Vic's feet, and moments later, boom, the FBI hits the place. Okay, and Vic's down in the apartment below with his girlfriend, and the two sons, are upstairs. And they go to the bureau. Just leave. Don't hurt my father. Don't hurt our father. So the bureau goes down. And and all they have are shotguns in the house, right? I mean, which they had. It was good that they had them for their own protection because of the war. And then basically, what happens is some FBI guy does a search and comes in with his bag. And interestingly, after they had already unloaded the guns, after the FBI had already released the shells from the two shotguns, they find inside the bag, interestingly, a shotgun shell with Vic Arena's latent fingerprint on it, okay? And no prints on any of the other guns. So they literally planted this thing. I mean, talk about, this is the FBI that did this, man, okay?
That is incredible. That
led to Vic getting arrested, indicted, and they did a perp walk in 2020 in front of 26 Federal Plaza with Linda Vecchio leading the way. It was a huge victory for the Bureau. And then eventually Vic Arena was convicted in this trial. And I go into an elaborate discussion of Vic Arena's trial and how the many legal problems with it. But the Bureau was so bound and determined to get Vic Arena. They couldn't kill him, so they put him away in prison, okay? So now the ground is fertile for a potential Scarpa takeover. And if Scarpa had been the boss, even if it was for half a year or a year, depending on his health, it would have been a massive victory for the FBI to have that kind of informant on the commission. So, it just but time began to go by, and because the war became so violent and so many guys were killed. I mean, Scarpa, he basically shot one guy stringing Christmas tree lights outside of his house. They accidentally killed a member of the Genovese family standing outside a social club because he looked like somebody else. They killed this guy, Nicky Black Brancho, a bald-headed captain who was being watched from a plant or a perch by the FBI above his social club, and also two NYPD detectives, part of the Colombo squad, were watching him because they were wanting to protect these guys. And this is where we get to answer your question after all this time. When did people really suspect that there was a serious problem with Linda Vecchio and Scarpa? It was when Chris Favo, who was DeVecchio's number two, and several other agents, Tomlinson and another agent that were part of the squad, began to find, they get intelligence, right, on a Monday about a certain guy who Scarpa would have wanted to kill, right? And they would talk about it and share it within the squad. And then on a Thursday, he'd be dead. Okay. And that happened more than a few times. And they began to realize there's a leak. There's a mole somewhere in this. And then there was this thing called a hello line in the squad where Scarpa would call. And they just began to, it was unmistakable because by then Lynn DeVecchio, in my opinion, began to get sloppy as well. And so Lynn was ultimately brought up because Favo went to ratted out on Lynn, if you will. Lynn was subject to what's called an OPR, an Office of Professional Responsibility Investigation. But they immunized him, which is, why would they do that if they didn't really want to cover it up? If you give somebody immunity, they have no incentive in telling the truth, right?
Right, of course.
So they immunized Lynn DeVecchio, and the whole OPR went nowhere. And he in his book, he says, I was vindicated. Well, you can call it what you will, but basically later in another trial. So there, by the way, there were 75 cases in the Colombo War, the third war in Brooklyn in the Eastern District, Brooklyn Federal District, 75 cases. And a certain judge named Sifton threw out, I think, 9 of the 75 initially, because when word began to surface in the New York press about this unholy alliance between the G-Man and the Hitman, Scarpa, right? And they, in the feds, as you know, in criminal court, in criminal federal practice, they have a thing called the Brady rules, which means that the government is duty-bound to share any exculpatory evidence with the defendant. You know, I have a law degree. I went to Fordham, I'm proud to say, but I never practiced law. But, you know, Brady material, failing to get Brady material is significant. So a judge dismissed 9 of these 75 cases. Now the feds are freaking out. You're going to lose more of them if this whole thing with this mishegas, if you will, to use a legal term, with Scarpa and DeVecchio continues. So, but here is the thing that is, I know I'm talking, and I'm not even letting you ask questions on this, but this is the thing that strangely, and this is an only in New York story, that ties the Greg Scarpa Sr. story to the terrorism story, the FBI's failures on the road to 9/11. You mentioned, I think I did 4 books for HarperCollins. That was, at the time, the largest English language publisher in the world between 2003 and 2013. 1,000 Years for Revenge was the first book. The second was called Cover Up, which is largely on the 9/11 Commission. And the third was called Triple Cross, which ironically documented the FBI's relationship with Ali Muhammad, who was an FBI informant, who was an al-Qaeda, not just a terrorist, but it was this uber spy for al-Qaeda, their principal intelligence officer that moved bin Laden in and out of Afghanistan. He ended up defecting to America, passed a watch list. He enlisted in the U.S. Army, ended up at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and despite not having any kind of a security clearance, he's bringing top-secret intelligence up to the World Trade Center bombing crew that was run by Ramzi Youssef, the bomber that was responsible not just for the 1993 bombing of the Trade Center, but, as I prove in my books, for the 9/11 attack. So Ali Muhammad is another one of these guys that elements of the U.S. government, in this case the FBI, allowed to stay on the street. He had an agent, a hapless agent on the West Coast called John Zent, Z-E-N-T, who was kind of another Anthony Villano kind of a figure. And basically, he got Ali Muhammad was arrested by the Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, when he was trying to infill to the U.S. through Canada, an absolute world-class terrorist, and they caught him. And they had him in a room at the airport in, Vancouver, and he just gave them the phone number of Zent. They called Zent, and Zent vouched for him, and they let him go. He went on to then plan the East African embassy bombings that killed how many people? So that was my third book, Triple Cross. Now, why is the terrorism story connected? And it's connected through Greg Scarpa Jr., because Greg Jr. was arrested in 1988 and eventually convicted of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. Not a single murder, but, murder, conspiracy. And his main defense was, my father told me to do it, and my father was working with the advice and consent of the FBI. But the judge on the case, Rena Raji, had been an ex-assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District, Brooklyn, where this happened, and she basically threw the book at Scarpa and gave him 40 years in prison. She claimed that he was lying about all this. It was a fabrication.
Scarpa Jr., I want to be clear. Scarpa Jr., because what happened was, this is all documented in my book, Deal with the Devil. Scarpa Jr. is in the MCC, what I'll now call the Jeffrey Epstein Memorial Federal Lockup in Manhattan, okay? That federal, lockup prison right next to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District, and then the federal court, right? Down at Foley Square. Sure, right.
And that MCC had a terror wing on it, like a terrorism tier, they called it. And so in I want to get this right, 97, I want to say, for 11 months, after Ramzi Youssef, the original World Trade Center bomber, who was the most wanted man on earth, after he fled New York in 93, after he failed to knock Tower 1 into Tower 2, but he always had this plan to do it one way or the other. And so he flees, and he tries to kill Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan. He ends up in Manila with none other than his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the guy the FBI later called the mastermind of 9/11, and Youssef, Youssef was to operations what Ali Muhammad was to intelligence. When you fight a war, you need two capabilities. You need operations, somebody on the ground to blow things up, and then intelligence, spies in the field, right? You need to know what your enemy knows ahead of time, right? So they were covered. Al-Qaeda was brilliantly covered by Ramzi Youssef in operations and Ali Mohammed in intelligence. So Ramzi Youssef is in Manila with KSM and Youssef's oldest friend, Abdul Hakim Murad, a pilot trained in 4 U.S. flight schools. He was going to be, when Youssef conceived the 9/11 planes as missiles plot, he did it in Manila in the late 1994 into 1995, okay? And what happened was they had a fire in their bomb factory in Manila, and this alert, Philippines National Police officer named Ada Farascal, a woman, basically came in there and busted Abdul Hakim Murad. Youssef fled with Khalid Sheikh to Islamabad, okay? And so now they have Abdul Hakim Murad, and they waterboard him, they tried everything, they torture him, and then they turn him over to a guy named Colonel Rodolfo B. Mendoza, Boogie Mendoza. And Mendoza was brilliant. He was a world-class authority on terrorism, and he basically unlocked Abdul Hakim Murad by using trickery and guile as opposed to force and torture, okay? He locked him in a barracks. They did sleep and food deprivation for a couple of days, put a hood over his head, and he was starving, and they finally brought a Big Mac and fries in one day. And he was salivating, and so Boogie Mendoza says, tell me something and I will let you eat this, right? And the guy says, he tells him something about the World Trade Center bombing that he could have read in Time magazine. And Boogie takes the sandwich, takes a bite, and leaves. No, I will tell you something. And finally, after X number of days, he gives him the whole playbook on Ramzi Youssef, the plot to, to fly the planes, everything. So Boogie Mendoza sends all of this, and I actually talked to the courier that took the information from Camp Krama in the Philippines, where Mendoza did the interrogation. His report took it to the U.S. Embassy. He saw it go into a pouch bound for the Southern District of New York, where Youssef was eventually captured, rendered back, and was about to go on trial. And the Southern District had this warning about 9/11 way back then, okay?
That's absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing.
And Greg Jr., so Greg Scarpa Jr. is the linchpin of that. And I have to tell you this one other thing that really makes you want to pull your hair out, but it makes you understand how the feds could have, not only do I prove they could have stopped the first bombing in 93 through this courageous FBI agent named Nancy Floyd and this undercover operative named Ahmed Salem, but later, while Youssef is on the tier and Greg is in between the two, I mean, Greg is a mob guy, so he's a world-class con man, right? And so Youssef is in one cell, Murad's in the other. They break bed struts away and they start passing little notes they call kites through. And Greg says, it's not going to be in Arabic. It's got to be in English. I don't trust you much, but I want you to know I hate America. The mob does as much as you guys do, so I will cooperate with you. Well, meanwhile, what does Greg do? He calls the Bureau. And he starts ratting these guys out for 11 months, risking his life. They have a female FBI agent posing as a paralegal. They give him a camera, and he's photographing all these notes. And there are dozens and dozens of FBI 302 memos, many of whom are on my website, documenting all of this intelligence. And one of the most stunning things that happens is that there was a payphone on the tier not far from Youssef's cell that occasionally prisoners would use, okay? And so somebody gets the idea, let's set up a phony mafia front company. I think Greg came up with the idea. And they ended up calling it Roma Corp. Not very imaginative of the Bureau. They named it after a tomato, an Italian tomato, but whatever. Roma Corp, okay? And it's supposed to be in the Flatiron building, located. It has an address and everything. It's got a phone number and a fax number. And Scarpa Jr. convinces Youssef and Murad that if Ramzi goes and makes phone calls, the mob guys will patch him through to like somebody in a third party country, right? Okay, you follow me?
I'm with you.
So he starts calling this, not realizing that the guys on the other end are FBI agents, not mafiosi. Okay. However, the Bureau only has somebody who speaks Arabic on the other line, and Youssef is talking in Urdu and other exotic dialects, and he actually gets through to somebody who turns out to be KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is hiding out in Doha, Qatar, under the protection of the Al Thani regime, which is kind of like the House of Saud of Qatar. they were very pro kind of Al-Qaeda at the time. And he's being protected. The mastermind of 9/11, Yusuf's uncle, okay? And you'd think, so finally the FBI, they think about, should we go? And they finally send the HRT, the hostage rescue team, which is the boom, kick the door in guys that do the renditions, right? Heroic people. And they go and they get to the airport, and one of the Al-Thani says, sorry, gentlemen, this is our country. Just wait, and we'll let you know when it's free to go to see this man at whatever this location is. In the meantime, they spirit him out to the Czech Republic, get him a new identity, only to have him go on to create, perfect Ramsey's planes as missiles plot on 9/11, and 3,000 people die and the towers go down and they hit the Pentagon in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We all saw it a week and a half ago. We're reminded of it. And that could have been interdicted earlier. And Greg Scarpa Jr. should have gotten a medal for that. A medal. Instead, he gets 40 years in prison. Whereupon, and he's in the Supermax in Florence, Colorado, the baddest of all the federal jails, where Yusuf is and Murad is. And what's amazing is in 2005, after all they've done with him, turns out he's in a parallel cell with Terry Nichols, as in the Oklahoma City bomber. McVeigh is dead, right? Right?
Sure.
Terry Nichols now is convicted. And Terry Nichols says to Greg one day, and we have time, I'll tell you how he learned it. It's an unbelievable story how Scarpa in this prison where you're not even supposed to talk. You get an hour to exercise during the day. You run up and back and forth in a cage. You can't say a word to the guy next to you, and you get your meals in your room. There's no commissary. So how the hell did Scarpa get? I'll tell you how he learned this information. Terry Nichols on the what's going to be the 10th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing says to Scarpa, I had a bunch of Kine sticks, which are high explosives, buried in a crawl space in my house in Harrington, Kansas. And the Bureau never found it. And I'm worried that Others Unknown, which was the name of the book that was written by the lawyer for Timothy McVeigh that absolutely believed there was a broader conspiracy beyond these two guys, I'm afraid somebody's going to use it and people will die. All right? So Greg Scarpa Jr. talks to Angela Clementi, this remarkable
sure, I know
investigative
Angela. She's
research. Angela.
Yep.
Right. Yep. Okay. So and then other people are spoken to, and the Bureau ignores it. And then I talked to somebody at the AP in Washington, and finally, through mutually through all of us kind of putting pressure on, the FBI goes there, and what do you think they find? Exactly where Nichols told Scarpa. They find the high explosives and they secure it. Okay, so this is not just the first time where he 11 months risked his life with these two terrorists. He also risked his life with Terry Nichols. Okay, and again, he stays in prison. Finally, he gets cancer, and they move him to Terre Haute, to another federal prison that's less confining. But he has serious, So I wrote to Judge Corman. I sent Judge Corman a copy of my last book, and which chronicled Scarpa Jr.'s, exploits and what he did for the country. And I was one of many, including Angela and others, that really pleaded with this judge to show him some mercy. So in 2020, he was finally released, and I spoke to him tonight for about an hour. He's in really great spirits. If anybody deserves to be bitter about the way he was treated by the U.S. government, it's Greg Scarpa Jr., because, again, I'm not saying he was a choir boy, but if he participated in any kind of crime, it was at the behest of his father, who told him to do it. And he was loyal to his father, and he earned. He made money, he profited. He wasn't wearing wings as an angel, but it was all while his father was working for the Bureau. And anyone, whether it was Villano or Linda Vecchio, it defies belief that they didn't know what was going on with him.
I want to try to come back to the terrorism aspect of things in a moment, but just to go back to the mafia aspect of them, and it's amazing that these two worlds have collided in a manner that you've exposed in your books here. And I want to encourage people, because we're just touching the tip of the iceberg here, to check out your website at peterlance.com, spelled exactly how it sounds. But you mentioned Christopher Favo, the FBI agent that reported to Scarpa. Favo said that when he was reported to DeVecchio. Favo had said that when he was informing DeVecchio about some murders that benefited the faction of the Colombo crime family that Scarpa was affiliated with, that essentially DeVecchio said, we're going to win this thing. Now, people may remember that even if they're not familiar with this case, because Agent Harris, an FBI agent on The Sopranos, who was aiding Tony Soprano in his mob war, did the same thing in the last episode.
You see Metro News? Your old beat. Philly Tardo got popped.
Damn, you're going to win this thing.
By the way, the person that played that agent was called Frank Pellegrino, as in Rayos. I mean, he passed away at some point, but they called him Frankie No, because people would call up to get a reservation.
Couldn't get a reservation.
And they go, no.
Yeah, he was actually Agent Harris's boss, but the point is still now. We had when I was still producing Curtis Lewa's show. Amazingly, DeVecchio agreed to do an interview with Curtis, and DeVecchio actually was so bold as to name his book "We're Gonna Win This Thing," and Curtis asked him about that line of saying "We're gonna win this thing." This is what DeVecchio told Curtis. This is about 10 years ago.
And I did make that statement. This subordinate of mine came into my office one morning and said, man by the name of Larry Lampesi had just been found shot. He was a member of the Colombo family, not an active one. And at the time, we were actually way ahead of the game. We had arrested a number of people. We had good intelligence. We were stopping a lot of hits that were going on because we had teams out looking for the shooters. And I literally did slam my hand in desk and say, we're going to win this thing, meaning we, the FBI, were going to get rid of an entire, or at least dismantle an entire organized crime family, which had been my goal for years, to try to do that.
So good, so good, so good.
Great brands, great prices. Everyone's got a reason to rack.
You know they have Marc Jacobs?
Nike? Yes. Just so many good brands.
Vince, Birkenstock, and more brands you love are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
Lowe's knows you don't want to sacrifice reliability for savings. This July 4th, get up to 40% off select LG appliances and purchase 2 or 3 select major appliances to get an additional 10% off. Save big on LG, America's most reliable line of home appliances at Lowe's. Based on independent reliability surveys 2021 to 2024 and select major appliances as compared to competing manufacturers offering full appliance lines. See associate for more details. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. Exclusions apply. Valid 6/18 through 7/9.
Is there any chance that DeVecchio is telling the truth there?
No. Look, Chris Favo, if he was in the room with him, he looked at the body language, he understood it, and he was willing to put his career at risk. That's how worried he was. At one point, I think Favo and Tomlinson, or there was Tomlinson and one other agent that were summoned that went out to see Scarpa at his house in Brooklyn. Okay. And Lynn is there leading it. And so Lynn basically, I guess little Linda and Joey are watching TV, and it's kind of like in the main room. And so Lynn parks the 2 agents in front of the TV, and they turn up the TV, and he goes in and has this private meeting with Scarpa in the kitchen. And these agents are like left out. They have no idea what's going on. And they literally, as I said earlier, with regard to Nicky Grancho and these other targets of Scarpa, have their lives in their hands. These FBI agents are in the position of trying to keep mafiosi that Scarpa Sr. is trying to kill alive. But they're cut out of this meeting by their boss. So they were absolutely gung-ho for this OPR. But when the trial happened, as I said earlier, the FBI set up the Justice Department set up 2 senior officials who literally sat in the jury booth like hawks, staring like 6 feet away from the witness booth. And both Favo and these other agents they were paper tigers by then. They weren't gonna lose their careers. They saw how Lynn got a wrist slap. Lynn was allowed to retire with a full pension. Right? He's down in Florida riding his motorcycle and clipping coupons, okay, right? And he wrote a book, and he beat this murder trial in Brooklyn. He became kind of a celebrity among, FBI agents. And by the way, I have written a 10-hour limited series of scripts called Deal with the Devil based on this whole story, okay? That is kind of out to producers. And it's the absolute full unexpurgated story of this whole investigation over many years. And Lynn DeVecchio was an incredibly interesting and colorful figure. And I believe at some point, I think even Favo has said, I don't have the exact quote, but he believes he was basically captured by Scarpa. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
He was
like Stockholm Syndrome
Scarpa
almost.
He was this charismatic figure, okay? And so it's just a remarkable story because the terrorism component of it is what distinguishes it. And the thing about, I want to say something that's important in the climate we're in right now, Frank. It's very important for me to state this. I really admire the FBI. We need the FBI. Sure. There are tens of thousands of great FBI agents, men and women, that risk their lives every day for us. There are certain people in management who are questionable, and there always have been. Since Hoover, the Justice Department has been a political organization through multiple administrations, Democratic and Republican. I mean, look at how many people were convicted when Nixon was president. I think 2 attorney generals. And then, look at the politicization of the Bureau under Trump. It was extraordinary, right? And some would say on the other side it happened with under Obama and his attorney general, Eric Holder, to a certain degree in the Fast and Furious scandal. They point to that. So, but the idea that a huge part of the Republican Party and the Republican caucus in Congress have bought the big lie, and that they are literally, every time Trump makes an utterance that implicitly threatens FBI agents, and they dox them, and people, the people that are followers of MAGA followers who are capable of committing violence. That is where you have to draw the line.
I think that's definitely a subject for a separate show, which I'm happy to do with you. That'll be a lot of fun. We've been talking about this trial that took place in Brooklyn. DeVecchio was able to be unconvicted of these 4 murders. Recently, I asked Judge John Gleeson, who before he was a federal judge, recently retired from the bench, he was a prosecutor. He was responsible for prosecuting Colombo crime family mobsters like Vic Arena, and for, obviously, very famously, John Gotti. Recently wrote a book called The Gotti Wars about that. I asked him about Lindley DeVecchio and whether DeVecchio crossed the line into criminality. This is what he said.
Well, look, it's a little more nuanced than that, Frank. Do I believe that Lynn DeVecchio crossed the line in the sense of aiding and abetting murders as that withdrawn prosecution charged him? No. Do I believe he got way too close to Scarpa and that the agents in his squad, Chris Favo, Jeff Tomlinson, 2 others, Ray Andish, Howard Ledbetter, do I believe that those special agents under Lynn's supervision properly reported to Lynn's supervisors that Lynn got too close to Greg Scarpa? Absolutely. So, if the line's criminality, non-criminality, I don't have any reason to believe that Lynn engaged in criminal acts. Did he lose his balance in handling Greg Scarpa? Yes, I believe that.
What's your reaction to Judge Gleason's comments there?
Well, look, I have respect for any federal judge, and, he has an accomplished career, but I would like to send him Deal with the Devil and have him read it. I don't know if he's ever read it, but look, you have to understand that he's rooting for Team Fed, right? Sure. He was a federal prosecutor in Brooklyn, and he then became a federal judge, as so many have, like Rena Raji, the one that sentenced Greg Scarpa. And I would say, and I'm not tarring Judge Gleason with this brush because I don't know enough about his career independently, but I would say that it's virtually unknown for any former federal assistant U.S. attorney, an ex-Fed, to be critical of the Justice Department, whether it's about an era that they were involved in or not. You look at all the talking heads on MSNBC and CNN throughout the entire Trump administration, and they may say things critical of an individual like Attorney General at the time, but they never criticize the DOJ. And that, to me, is part of the problem. The FBI and the DOJ are impervious to criticism. And when you are impervious to criticism, and the OPR system is such that, you're basically investigating yourselves, right? How do you get better? How do you make a system better? Does it take a Whitey Bulger situation to blow up into the public eye for somebody like John Connolly to get away? Does it take a Greg Scarpa, Lynn DeVecchio situation, where the feds went out of their way? By the way, the feds not only paid the legal fees, part of Lynn DeVecchio's legal fees, which is unheard of. He's accused of murders, and that had to be approved by the Attorney General at the time. Okay, when that happened, right? So, I mean, that's the way it is. The Attorney General has to approve like an exception like that. But they sent these guys up. And then here's another thing that they did that is extraordinary. During DeVecchio's trial, Greg Scarpa Jr. would have made an amazing witness for the Brooklyn District Attorney. So they arranged to move him from the Supermax at the time to the MCC to wait, while a trial was going on so that they could call him. But eventually they didn't have to because Linda Shiro was, basically the trial unraveled when it was the tapes were played that Jerry Capisci and Tom Robinson recorded years earlier, and I believe very conveniently waited till her testimony to bring them forward. I mean, they knew she was going to be a star witness, but they kind of held them back. The trial unraveled, and they didn't get to the point of Greg Scarpa. But you know what the feds did? They brought Abdul Hakim Murad, Ramzi Youssef's partner, a convicted terrorist who was on one side of Greg for 11 months. During that period, he was stinging Al-Qaeda. And they brought him to New York to put him on the same tier to effectively glower at Greg Scarpa. Imagine what kind of stress and tension that would have put on Scarpa Jr. Imagine that. Now, only the feds, the Bureau of Prison, the Department of Justice could have countenanced the removal from the biggest lockdown in America, the ADX Florence, where he was, to the MCC. What purpose did they have other than witness intimidation? So I would suggest that it would do my heart a lot of good, and I'll send, if you have Judge Gleason's address, I'll send him a signed hardcover first edition and see if he, would be willing to, maybe reassess his judgment with respect to the knowledge that Scarpa had. Because one of the things that I prove in my book,
and the knowledge that DeVecchio had, because one of the things, thank you, one of the things I repeatedly describe in my book, because I have all these FBI 209 memos, is that Lynn DeVecchio knowingly misconstrued some of the information he got for Scarpa Jr. Like, he knew that Scarpa Jr. had done certain scores and certain hits, and he attributed it to other members of the family. And by saying things like, well, informant 34 informs us that this was done by so-and-so factions of the so-and-so family. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
When he knew that Scarpa did it, and if he didn't know, he was utterly incompetent, and Lynn DeVecchio was too smart to run two squads in the New York office and be that incompetent. This is what I'm trying to say.
No, I get that. And in that interview with Curtis, DeVecchio talked about that Brooklyn trial.
His cooperating witnesses had already come in and testified in federal court about all these crimes. He chose to go ahead and indict me. And the only witness they had the first 2 weeks of the trial, my name was not mentioned one time. It was a window dressing, and the only witness that came in against me was Linda Shiro, who absolutely fabricated the entire thing. And you could see that after she started getting cross-examined. She couldn't remember what she did the week or the day before her story started falling apart. She'd been very well scripted for the grand jury. When it came to trial time, she couldn't remember anything. And we had ample proof that everything she said was completely fabricated. And I couldn't have been happier when Robbins and Capisci came in with their tapes and showing that she not only was a liar, but she had made all this up. She completely exonerated me in the criminal acts for which I was charged. I couldn't have been happier, Curtis, believe me.
So I asked Mike Vecchione, who was the chief assistant DA in charge of this prosecution, when he wrote a book with Jerry Schmetterer about their time in the DA's office. Schmetterer was more in the public relations area of things in the DA's office. I asked them why they chose, with all this other evidence, even if Linda Shiro's credibility was impeached with this Tom Robbins, Jerry Capisi audio, why did they drop the case? This is what they said about their decision to drop the case. And then as you hear this, I want you to tell me whether you think you would have made the same decision, even though you never practiced law, you've got a law degree, if you were in their shoes.
We were able to put together an indictment in which DeVecchio was charged with assisting, and in New York, an assist in a murder is the same as committing the murder, of 4 separate murders, 4 separate individuals. And we went to trial. He went to trial, I should say. And he waived the jury and went to trial in front of a judge you just mentioned, Reichbach, who, interestingly enough, led some of the Columbia demonstrations back in the 60s. He was so anti-FBI, it was incredible. But didn't make any sense to me why he waived the jury, but he did. But Reichbach was a great judge. Reichbach was the kind of guy, although he tended to be politically to the left, he was right down the middle when you talked about the law and trials in the courtroom. And I was very happy to have him because he was smart as well. And then the trial in the middle, I would say right in the middle of Linda Shiro's testimony, literally I got tapped on the back at the end of a day, and it was a lawyer for the Village Voice who told me that I should go back to my office and check the Village Voice website. And I went back and got Jerry, and I said to Jerry, what's going on? And he said, you better come up here. So I went up to his office. And
so, Jerry, then you see the story that Linda Shiro had done this interview with Tom Robbins and Jerry Capisi, 2 journalists who write about crime, and Tom was writing with the Village Voice at the time. Tom Robbins discovers the set of audio recordings from 10 years ago in which your star witness, Linda Shiro, completely contradicts much of what she said on the witness stand. I can't imagine the reaction. Tell me what happened.
Well, my first reaction was it was an incredible coincidence to me that in the middle of the trial, and when things were pretty much going our way, they come up with these recordings. And I was a colleague as a newspaper reporter of both Jerry Capisi and Tom Robbins, and they were good reporters. But it was very strange to me that why didn't they bring this stuff to us before the trials began? There was a lot of publicity about this case. The indictment of DeVecchio was big news when you indict an FBI agent for 4 murders. And I feel that they grandstanded and they kind of created a lot of difficulties for us.
But you guys chose, the DA's office chose to drop the case and not go forward and wait for a verdict.
Look, the DA was put in a very difficult situation. And I said to him, she only contradicted 2 of the murders, which she had testified to in court, now being part of what DeVecchio did. So there was one left that we hadn't even gotten to yet. And there was an earlier murder that she hadn't contradicted. But he felt, and I have to say, that I agree with him with this because I told him that I would do this, and that is to dismiss the case because we were relying on someone who was, at this point, patently unreliable. And I was asked by the press, and I was asked by the DA, and I think I write it in the book, if I had known this before, would I have gone forward with the case? And the answer was no, I wouldn't have, because Linda Shiro was the bedrock of this case. So we dismissed it.
Peter, I take it you think it was, and I appreciate you listening to the whole explanation, but I take it you think it was a mistake to drop that prosecution.
Well, first of all, one of the things, I agree with what, was it Schmetterer, the guy, the former journalist?
Yes.
Right, writer of the book that said that he thought it was kind of curious that they hadn't come forward. I made that point earlier.
Right.
They knew that Linda Shiro. Lynn was indicted in March of 2006. This is the fall of 2007. They lie in wait, as I would put it, for her to get on the stand. And as I remember it, and I wish I had the book and the details in front of me, but I think that not only did she only really fully contradicted one of the 4 cases. And involving Joe Domenico was the one case I believe that she absolutely did not, but she was equivocal in her language about the second case that that Vecchione described. And 2 of the murders, of the 4 murders, she didn't contradict at all. So this is what Mike Vecchione did that was astonishing to me, is he painted himself into a corner. On the basis of just hearing these, very briefly hearing these recordings, he stood up there and said, Judge, we're throwing the towel in, effectively. Mm-hmm. He didn't say, Your Honor, we want to finish our case in chief. We want to make our full case. There are many witnesses. And by the way, it wasn't just, he later called her the key witness, that they based their entire case on. That's absurd. They had many, many other pieces of evidence that pointed to Linda Vecchio's conspiracy with Scarpa, including the testimony of these FBI agents who, they did a terrible job of cross-examining and, rehabilitating. But another thing that had happened, let me just say this, that Mike Vecchione couldn't present the case himself, really. He had to step back. Because several members of the office were tainted because they had looked at some of the immunized testimony of Linda Vecchio in the OPR, and there was what's called a Castigar violation. So he was actually counting on his 3rd team after months and months of preparation, literally went to trial in this incredibly high-profile case after doing multiple cases himself over the many months before then. So he was kind of exhausted. He wasn't presenting the case himself. Assistants were. And they had a lot of other evidence, including 2 of the murders that were unbelievably powerful that Linda corroborated. And I was able to corroborate her testimony on, throughout my book, I talk about how reliable her testimony was in many areas. I mean, she was literally with Scarpa. It wasn't Senior. It wasn't a situation where he told her everything. You know, the classic story of the honey, I don't want to,
sure.
I'm a mob guy. I don't want you to know. Edie Falco and The Sopranos, Tony, I got some veal palm here. What'd you do for work today? No, Carmi, I'm not going to tell you. No, he shared everything with her. He'd get a phone call from Scarpa to call him on a payphone, and she'd go there, and then he'd tell her exactly right afterwards, contemporaneously, what the conversation was. He said this, I said that. You know what I mean? It was really powerful stuff. And, it was just unnecessary to throw in the towel, in my opinion. But the Brooklyn DA, it was their case to lose, and they just tossed it away precipitously and early on, I believe, before they really got a chance to present their full case.
As far as I'm concerned, even if you take away the terrorism aspect of it, this has got to be the DeVecchio-Scarpa relationship and the crimes committed and the complacency of the FBI. This has got to be one of the most interesting mob cases in history. Then you add the terrorism aspect of it that you've covered in your books. It is by far the most interesting criminal case in the history of the world. Yet I don't think there's ever really been a good motion picture or television series depicting the DeVecchio-Scarpa incidents. Am I missing one? Has there been a good movie on this?
No, there hasn't. And in fact, I've written this 10-hour series that maybe I can send you the first hour and see what you think.
Yeah.
I have a 100-page graphic Bible describing the series, and I have 10 one-hour scripts that tell the entire epic story. The way I construct the series is that I'm doing the voiceover myself because it's an epic story and you clearly need voiceover. As my longtime mentor, Nick Pileggi, who took me under his wing many years ago, if you look at Goodfellas and Casino, massive voiceover. Because if you're just doing a story about a simple murder that takes place over 48 hours, it's easy. But when you're telling an epic story that takes place over multiple years, and in this case, when the terrorism story, also multiple continents, you know what I mean? You need voiceover to help you knit it together and explain it. And what happened to me was I was subpoenaed in that trial by both the Brooklyn DA and DeVecchio's defense to give up my sources. I was prepared to go to jail rather than do that, and they had this thing called a Castigar hearing prior. It was in August. The trial started, I think, in October. And Castigar was a federal case. It was the Ollie North defense. It stood for the notion that if an individual defendant has been a prior grant of immunity, whoever tries to prosecute that defendant for other crimes has to build a firewall in between the immunized testimony and the new investigation, all right? And in fact, Judge Walsh, who was the special prosecutor in Iran-Contra, who convicted Ollie North, eventually lost the case on appeal because Ollie North had been immunized before the Senate in his famous testimony, where he raised his right hand with all the medals on his chest before the Senate committee. So the point is that several members of the Brooklyn DA's office read, how sloppy is that from a legal standpoint, to knowing how like radioactive the immunized testimony of DeVecchio was. And yet the defense of DeVecchio was alleging, and the Brooklyn DA subpoenaed me on the same point, because I had given a copy of my book Cover Up, which is mostly about the 9/11 Commission, my second HarperCollins book, where I had a chapter or two about the first time I talked about the Scarpa story in it, and this whole Mississippi burning case that he broke, which is another incredibly amazing aspect of the story. He solved the Mississippi burning case. It was Scarpa that did it. In the movie, there's like an African-American FBI agent. No, it was Greg Scarpa who kidnapped a Klan member, took him to a cabin in the woods, basically put a gun to his head, and asked him where the bodies they had found there burned out. Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, they found their burned out station wagon. These poor, wonderful civil rights workers that were murdered by the Klan found the wagon, but Hoover was going nuts. Bobby Kennedy was going nuts. They had hundreds of FBI agents stomping around Philadelphia, Mississippi, could not get any leads because people were terrified of the Klan. So Scarpa goes down, is paid by the Bureau, is given a gun by the Bureau, kidnaps a Klan member who is the mayor of the town, and gets him and puts the gun to the head, asks him, the guy is more afraid of the Klan, won't do it. Then he cocks the gun, puts it in the guy's mouth, asks him again. The guy still won't talk. And finally, Scarpa undoes his belt, pulls out a straight razor, and makes a move toward emasculating him. And that's when the guy gave up the location of the bodies in an earthen dam, and that the case was solved. And, the Scarpa proved himself as the FBI's best secret weapon. He later helped in another civil rights murder of a guy named Vernon Dahmer, who was murdered and his house was burned down. Scarpa went down on that case. And good old, Robbins and Capisci, and Capisci is the one who broke that story initially in the Daily News, the Mississippi burning story. He had all kinds of facts wrong about it. And later, he and Robbins, and I can't remember, I don't want to misspeak about Tom Robbins' involvement, but there were a lot of things that they got wrong because they conflated the two stories together. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. The second story involved a guy named Lawrence Bird who ran an appliance store. This time, Scarpa actually had the help of an FBI agent, and he went down and went into the store, bought a television, and they were, loading it into a car in the alley behind, and Scarpa with this FBI agent basically just grabbed this guy and put him in the trunk. And this time, they basically took him to a military base, and Scarpa threatened to strip him naked and tie him up in the woods so that animals could get to him. Okay, this is a guy working on behalf of the FBI. All right,
amazing.
And he broke that case as well. So but on one hand, he's getting results for the Bureau, and on the other hand, he's doing things that no top echelon informant. If there's even a hint of violence, even a hint that you're beating people up, let alone committing murders, you have to be closed instantly under the Attorney General's rules. And yet he committed, according to Larry Mazza, his killing partner in the last war, he stopped counting after 50 murders, which makes him not only the most prolific killer in the history of Cosa Nostra, but one of the great serial killers of all time. Okay? And yet he did most of this, except for 5 years, on the watch of Tony Villano and Lynn DeVecchio.
So we've talked about Whitey Bulger. We've talked about now Lynn DeVecchio and his relationship with Greg Scarpa Sr. There's also a lot of information that supports the fact that Frankie Blue Eyes Sparacco, another mobster, was working on as a top echelon informant. Do we have any idea how common the use of top echelon informants were by the FBI, and if the FBI still utilizes these top echelon informants these days?
I think you asked me that identical question when I first came on to talk about Deal with the Devil, and I didn't know the answer then, and I don't know it now, Frank. But you're consistent. I love your persistence.
Well, it's nine years later.
Question.
I figured you might find out.
No. But I haven't had a chance to do the independent research. But here's the point. This is the main point that I think. That these guys are professional con artists among their violent proclivities, okay? The mob guys really know how to spin a yarn and sell things, and that's why Scarpa, who had he was highly gifted, really had an advantage over Lynn DeVecchio. I'm not saying Lynn wasn't super bright, but Scarpa probably had a genius level of intelligence, in my opinion, given his survival rate, okay? That he walked this razor blade for so long. And these guys are able, and the Bureau, what did I say? As soon as Lynn got there, he had to start recruiting CIs. So they're hungry to get these guys. Now, what does it take for these guys to give them scraps like Scarpa did and do their own scores? I mean, he wrote the rule book on how to abuse the FBI, how to profit. He could have written a book, How to Profit as a Confidential Informant for the FBI. I mean, really. I mean, he's doing scores, he's taking a piece, he's giving some of it back, and then he's getting reward money that he's splitting with Tony Villano. Amazing. Now, I don't know what he did with Lynn DeVecchio, but the point is they played these guys like a fiddle, and it's important if people want to read Triple Cross, my third book about Ali Muhammad, he did the same thing with John Zed, his hapless agent on the West Coast. These guys are just not that bright in comparison with some of the world-class criminals that they're supposed to be handling.
Lastly, Peter, do we know these days what the status of Cosa Nostra is? You don't hear about a lot of, except for the situation involving the bizarre killing of the Gambino crime family boss a few years ago. We don't hear a great deal about gangland slayings anymore, and a lot of the activities that the mob seem to be really involved in for so many years, a lot of it seems to be legal these days. I'm curious if you're aware of what the status of Italian organized crime is these days.
Well, I ended Deal with the Devil in 2013 with a kind of afterword about Eric Holder's big mafia bust at the time. They had busted 100 guys. It was a big stunt. It was a
mafia takedown day.
Most of them were geriatric. They were like guys in their 70s and 80s. And because of RICO, and I absolutely believe that RICO is an absolutely unconstitutional law that was conceived by a law professor at Notre Dame University that gave the FBI a way of breaking the mafia. Why is it unconstitutional? In my humble opinion, Judge Gleason would probably take exception with me. I went to Fordham, and forgive me, Judge, if you went to Fordham or Columbia or NYU, I believe that the idea of RICO, Rackets Influence Corrupt Organization Act, was that the FBI would no longer have to put a guy away for a crime, prove that he committed a crime, right, and prove it in the traditional criminal sense, because the FBI had the omerta, the guys were sworn not to talk, and if they did, they'd be found out to be ratting, as they called it. They would be killed or worse. And so how are we going to beat these guys? So they came up with this notion where all they had to do was prove a pattern of racketeering activity with X number of predicate felonies involved over a certain period of time, and they could basically put it all together and put you away that way. Now, if there were murders involved that they could add as predicate felonies and things like that, fine. But RICO, in my opinion, was a real stretch constitutionally. But that was the main weapon they used. And then they got a lot of guys to flip, to turn state's evidence. And John, as you may know, I wrote the forward for John. They called him Junior Gotti.
Yeah, I interviewed you John, at the time about it.
Yeah, sure, yeah. And John Jr., which people commonly call him, was basically his father, being the capo di tutti capi of the Gambinos, was the only member of organized crime who had the power, as John called it, to put me on the shelf for life. Meaning he could sanction him withdrawing from the mob. The only way after you took the oath, that you could get out of the mob was in a box, or, if you were in a box basically, or you couldn't get out, or you go to prison for life, but you were still in the mob. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But John Jr. decided, given what had happened to his father, all the years and the multiple attempts, they finally got him on the fourth try. And even then, they had to, they basically had to make Bruce Cutler, his genius defense lawyer, a co-conspirator, so that he had another lawyer, at this time. And they had advantages by that point. And I'm not saying it wasn't a righteous conviction of John Gleason and company. But Junior wants to get out. He's got a family, and he wants to get out. So he makes a deal to do 6 years in federal prison, pay essentially millions of dollars in fines, and he's going to get out. He's going to withdraw from the mob under his father's sanction. Okay. Well, what happens is, and Curtis Sliwa will beg to differ about this, but he comes out, and the feds indict him 4 separate times more. And while he was in prison, by the way, he was subjected to what they call diesel therapy, where they would literally, in the middle of the night, grab them and move them to another prison somewhere. The family had no idea where they were. I'm not trying to play the violin for these guys.
Yeah, no, I covered. I was at every day of all 4 of those trials. It was really something.
Right, and John Jr. did real hard time. I think he did at least a third of his time in the hole, in solitary. But anyway, he gets out, and he's ready to start, again, afresh, he says. And they come after him. The 3 times, I believe, in the Curtis Sliwa thing, that all ended in mistrials, right? Where Curtis Sliwa alleged that he tried to have him killed because of his Curtis's criticism of, Gotti Sr. And then the last trial was this trial with John Alite, this guy that they literally had to pluck out of a Brazilian prison, who was the lowest level kind of a guy who had an early association in John Jr.'s life, who was not made. I think he's Albanian.
Yeah,
Forgive me if I get it wrong, but yeah.
But
John, what I'm trying to get at is John Alite was and he was hyper violent, and he committed all kinds of crimes, and they anointed him as their star witness, and basically that trial goes nowhere. And eventually, after 4 convictions, so John reached out to me, having read Deal with the Devil. He said, "Look, I'm writing my own book, and would you consider writing the foreword?" And I said, "I don't know the Gambino family the way I know the Columbos, but I'll tell you what, if you let me have full access to all your files, and I go to New York and I really am able to really do this, and I still come away believing that you were a victim of overreaching by the feds, I'll write the foreword." And I did. That was my conclusion. I wrote the foreword. It's called Shadow of My Father, the book. And
right. It's a great book. So, I've spoken with John about it at length. But in terms of the status of the mafia today, it sounds like maybe the mafia, because of the lengths that Holder had to go through to put that big mafia takedown day indictment together, that really maybe it's not such a big thing these days. Is that a fair statement?
Not the traditional Sicilian American mafia with the commission and the 5 New York families, in my opinion. But I don't stay on top of it every day. I don't read even. I used to subscribe to Jerry Capisci's, website or whatever you could.
Right, Gangland.
I don't do that. I haven't looked at this thing in years, so I can't really say. But I would suspect that the real threat of organized crime is from Eastern Europe, from the Russian mobs and the various satellite countries that are still very active, and then we have, of course, now we have another kind of organized threat in the country, and it's from domestic terrorism, if you will. So, yeah, I don't believe the mob anyway, and it's not to undercut your broadcast.
No, please.
I don't believe that traditional mafia, and in that sense, the FBI has succeeded, haven't they? But I would like to direct people to an article I wrote for the Huffington Post. I think I gave you a link. If you want to put it on, if you're able to put a link. It's called, I wrote it in 2006, and it was republished in 2011, and it's called Al-Qaeda and the Mob, How the FBI Blew It on 9/11. And it basically talks about this obsession to get Gotti, which was the number one priority of the New York office. Bruce Mao, the agent, the agent in charge of the Gotti case, they were obsessed with it for years and years. And it caused them, in my opinion, the NYO, the New York office, which had a tremendous number of really courageous agents, including FBI agent Nancy Floyd, another agent called Len Prednishenko, who was a bulwark against, Russian foreign counterintelligence, people at the UN, corrupt Russian agents, et cetera. Really great people helping our country. And and yet they took their eye off this metastasizing Al Qaeda cell.
No, it's a sin.
Ramzi Youssef was directing, that responsible for not just the '93 bombing, but 9/11, which is what I proved.
No, it's amazing. People should check out all of your books, even the ones that have nothing to do with the cases that we've been talking about. You are a gifted writer, and the stories that you've told, including the homicide at Rough Point, which I've had you on the radio a bunch of times talking about, are just incredible and have really moved the needle on reopening investigations that people never thought to reopen. And I want to encourage everybody to go to your website. They can delve into the details of some of the things that we've been talking about here and check out a lot of your other great books. Deal with the Devil, Triple Cross, Cover Up, Murder Inc., a whole bunch of great books. PeterLance.com. Peter, it's always a treat to talk with you. Thank you.
Frank, being on your show is a real joy. So thank you for the honor of being here.
No, the honor is all mine. If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with a friend. If somebody sent it to you, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button. Or search for The Racket Report wherever you get your podcasts. Share this on social media, send it to a friend, and help them know what's going on in terms of cases that maybe there's been popular misconception about, or, as you heard, about the nexus of metastasizing terrorist threat while the government was obsessed with getting Cosa Nostra, especially John Gotti, that you've never really heard before. This is The Racket Report. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.